I didn't really understand the significance of it at the time, but later when I found out that that was actually the date and time of the ACA inspection, I also realized that that was the first time in TDOC's history that on-the-job training officers were ever asked to work from 6 p.m. to 2 a.m. That has never happened before. It has not happened since.
Can you explain the significance of that? What does that mean?
Well, that means that you had roughly an additional 20 officers at the facility that by right would not have been there otherwise.
And it's an obvious question, but why do you think that is?
Honestly, I think they were trying to give the appearance of the facility having a larger number of officers than it otherwise would have.
Were you interviewed?
Yes, I was.
And were there managers present when you did your interview?
The associate warden at the prison, Charles Simmons, was present during my interview with Richard Stadler, I believe it was.
And did you feel like you could respond accurately to what you had witnessed in the prison with your boss sitting there?
I feel like the associate warden was present to not only as a way to intimidate me into not saying what I otherwise might have, but also to keep track of what I said.
Are there any other things you noticed the day of the inspection that were being done that maybe are not standard or not the normal course?
I had noticed some repairs that had been done to the facilities as far as certain locks that had been fixed that had been broken for a long period of time prior to the inspection investigation. You know, when I found out the ACA was only at the prison for 3 or 4 hours, you know, I mean, that really makes me wonder what all they managed to go see, because there's no way you can tour an entire facility in that little amount of time.
And tell me again, if you can explain the staffing, what would you say normal staffing is, and then what do you believe it may have been bolstered to the day of the inspection?
Normal staffing, if you look at the roster that was given to Mr. Stewart, I mean, you can see that on first shift they held over about 7 people, on third shift they held over about 7 people. One would expect that you would also hold over about 7 people on second shift as well. So to have an additional 7 officers from first shift stay over, plus nearly an additional 20 on-the-job training officers there at the time, I mean, that gives you an extra 27 officers just wandering around the compound.
Well, you've said that's never been done before.
To my knowledge, that has never been done before. The 6 p.m. to 2 a.m. shift has never been used for on-the-job training officers as long as I have been an officer at DeBerry Special Needs Facility, which is 3 years now. Prior to that, I've spoken to a couple of guys that have been there 10, 15, 30 years, and they say they cannot recall a time where that has ever occurred.
Why do you suppose the inspection was conducted in the evening hours, and was this at about the time of supper, after?
It would have been after supper. The only remaining movement calls for the day would have been a gym call and a church call. So there would have been very, very limited movement on the compound.
So the inspection started around supper time and continued into the evening?
It started approximately an hour and a half after dinner time.
What's that make it, 7:30?
No, it started at 6. 6:15-ish. Typically, our dinner time runs from about 4:45 to 5:15.
Can you tell us a little bit more about being interviewed? What did they ask you a lot of questions? Did you ask them a lot of questions? How did that go?
Basically, the questions I was asked were, what's going on at the prison? What can we do to fix things? I let Mr. Stadler know about the issues we were having with the 28-day cycle, the issues we were having with reporting incidents. We spoke for approximately 10 minutes, and at that point, Mr. Stadler kind of cut me off and said he didn't really have the time to listen to me anymore because he had 5 prisons to inspect within 3 days. So he needed to get back behind the fence and do his inspection.
Do you know of any other officers who were interviewed? Did they sort of get the same brush-off treatment, or?
I don't know specifically that anybody received the same brush-off treatment that I did, but I really don't feel that any of the other officers were able to have the amount of time that I did, or felt as comfortable being as forthcoming as I was.
Tyler, did you ask to be interviewed, or did they come to you to say, how did that work?
I did not ask to be interviewed at the time. Like I said, I didn't even know the ACA inspectors were there. Captain Scott, our chief of security, actually had somebody find me and ask me to come in and talk to the ACA inspectors.
Is the 6 p.m. to 2 a.m. time frame a more dangerous or less dangerous time in the Correctional Institute?
There's never a truly safe moment in corrections. However,
More or less dangerous?
We have a little bit more control over what's going on during 6 p.m. to 2 a.m. simply because there is less going on. We don't have all the programs running. There is not a lot of movement going on within the facility, so more officers can be placed where they need to be placed in order to keep things a little bit more secure.
In your experience, what kind of violence or misbehavior or danger arises at these institutions that better staffing would solve?
DeBerry Special Needs Facility is unique in the sense that we house mental health inmates that have much bigger issues than facilities such as Riverbend or Northwest. So that's not...
It's not predictable, is it?
It's not very predictable at all, because you never know when somebody's just going to snap.
Are there staffing shortages there at that facility where you work?
Absolutely. If there were no staffing shortages, we wouldn't be mandatory to be held over in the evening. You certainly would not be holding over 7 people per shift.
This inspection was a surprise to you. Do you think that other people in the prison knew that the inspection was coming?
Well, when I say the inspection was a surprise to me, what I'm saying is I did not know that they were there at that time. I knew they were scheduled to be there that day, but I didn't think they were going to be there that late in the evening. It was kind of my impression that they would have been there in the morning or during the day, when there would have been more people to talk to, as far as people in HR and people in administration, and some of our doctors and nursing staff who would have otherwise been there that had gone home for the day. I simply didn't expect them to be there that late.
In simplified terms, what's the problem and what's the solution?
It's my honest belief that the problem is Commissioner Schofield, and it's my honest belief that the solution would be to replace him and the administrators, which have made some extremely poor decisions, which have resulted in putting us in the position that we're in now. You have to understand, when Commissioner Schofield started, TDOC's budget was $648 million per year. Since he's been in office, our budget has ballooned to almost $1 billion a year. It's gone up by roughly $50 million a year, every year. Now, I know we're supposed to be talking about budget cuts, but at the end of the day, what you really have to ask yourself is, what have we gotten for this extra $300 million per year that we're giving the Department of Corrections now? Why are our prisons in so much worse shape now than they used to be? And ultimately, that is the Commissioner's responsibility. And if you look at his track record from Georgia, it's not the greatest.
You sound like you know a little more about what happened in Georgia. You want to share?
A lot of that information has come to my attention since I've started this. It has been, the information that I have found shows that as Commissioner Schofield moved up through the Georgia Department of Corrections ranks, he started creating more policies which resulted in issues and incidents within the Georgia Department of Corrections. It got to a point where he was, I can't remember the specifics, but I believe it got to the point where he was told, pack your bags and go.
What about the policies? What are they?
The policies were the 28-day cycle. He tried to implement at Georgia, which did not work out. He instituted, I really wish I could remember this.
What's a 28-day cycle? It doesn't sound like fireman's shift, 24 on, 48 off.
What the 28-day cycle is it's a way to restructure overtime so that the state only has to pay it once a month. Additionally,
oh, sorry.
Right. Oh, it gets better. Additionally, what it does is it allows for a federal exemption where the state can take 11 hours of your overtime pay in a 28-day period and pay you straight time for it. But what's really insidious about it is when you pay somebody all of their overtime on one paycheck, it affects their taxes. Recently, we had an officer work 168.9 hours in his first 2 weeks under this 28-day pay cycle. His paycheck for those 2 weeks, that 168.9 hours that he worked, was $1,127.50 before deductions and taxes. Now, if you do the math, you'll see that that comes out to $6.67 an hour is what he got paid for those 2 weeks. At the end of the month, yes, he will get all of the money that he earned. However, for the next 2 weeks as he works, everything that he earns is going to be considered overtime. So what's going to happen on his next check, he's going to get his base salary of $11,2750. In addition, he's going to have at least 80 hours of overtime, if not more. That's going to bump his tax bracket way up. So he's going to be paying more in taxes than ever before. And this is a guy that's already struggling with his mortgage because of the way that this 28-day pay cycle has come into effect.
And that's in Georgia, though, right?
Well, no, that's here in Tennessee now.
Under the same commissioner.
Under the same commissioner.
Bottom line, this audit will, they're not calling it an audit, but the results of this inspection will come out. Do you think it will be accurate? Is it an inaccurate portrayal of what's happening in the prison?
I do not think that this inspection is an accurate portrayal of what's happening, simply because of the fact that we tampered with what is actually happening.
Mike, I wanted to ask you, have you had any response at all from the governor's office? And go ahead, if you can, step up to the mic so we can get it. Has there been any response at all from the Department of Corrections or the governor to any of the issues that has been raised to you?
Early on, the commissioner came and met with me, and I believe that was a response. We have not, I sent a letter to the commissioner, and I believe I distributed the specific response he provided. I think what we have not seen, we've certainly received no response to our demand for an investigation for the unprecedented arrest of a rank-and-file employee, apparently under allegations that the employee obtained information and released it to the press. Something that I've talked to many people in this state, no one can ever remember ever occurring in this state, and which is an extraordinary event with an extraordinary potential to chill debate in our state. So I received no response to that. And most of all, we've received no response to our call for a true independent investigation of these allegations. Over and over again, we've been looking for the administration to not make an effort to create the impression of looking into these activities, but to actually conduct a real investigation. Everybody around this table is a reporter. You all know that at its most fundamental level, an investigation involves talking to people in a way that allows them to provide truthful information. What we heard today is that in this particular investigation, in which 5 prisons were visited in 3 days, each prison visited for a couple of hours at most, you had a completely false impression given because there was overstaffing, totally at odds with what normally happened in these institutions, and most importantly, you apparently had interviews that were conducted only in the presence of management. Well, I don't have to tell you that having an interview of a rank-and-file employee when his or her manager is sitting right there, that is not an interview. That is not an effort to get to the truth. Even when you're not in a situation where rank-and-file employees have already learned that if you provide information, you could be subject to arrest and strip search at your home. Or at least that is the sort of chilling tactic that this department is using. If these people really wanted to get to the truth, they could have taken these rank-and-file employees into a room and conducted confidential interviews, just like every one of you would have done had you yourselves been conducting an investigation. I guarantee you, just looking around this room, that if you were trying to get to the bottom of a particular activity, you would not conduct employee interviews with the employee's bosses sitting right there with them, because you would know as reporters that you might or might not be getting the real information. I think here, where we've already seen acts of retaliation, that alone just demonstrates what a complete sham the ACA inspection is. Let me go on, because that's not all. We raised earlier the conflict of interest presented by the fact that the department pays significant amounts of money to the ACA, or we thought, related institutions. And at the time there was some question raised, and I've got the Transparent Tennessee printout of the $40,800 or $900, $40,000, $600 payment to what is attributed to the Correctional Accreditation Managers Association. Just so you know, in conversations with the Tennessee State Employees Association, and I've provided a letter, the department has already confirmed that, in fact, the ACA itself received the $40,000. So we have a direct cash payment from our department to the ACA. It's a significant amount of money, and that alone demonstrates the cozy relationship between the department and the ACA. Remember what's really going on here. The ACA has already accredited these institutions. So you've got people from an organization that has accredited these institutions that are now supposed to come down and provide an independent insight into whether these institutions are operating effectively. Well, obviously they have a great interest in not challenging the assumption that their accreditation represents. This is not the first time this has been raised, by the way, and I'll turn your attention to a June 7th, 2001 Boston Globe article, which I think is extremely telling. In that article, there's a quote by James Gondels, who is one of the people. James Gondels is one of the inspectors that came down to conduct the investigation in Tennessee. In this case, there was an inspection scheduled for a facility in the Boston area. And the question was, could James, among others, could James Gondels conduct an independent investigation? In other words, exactly what he's supposedly doing in this particular case. Here's what he himself said when he was announcing that he was not going to conduct the inspection. He said, I had in my own mind an issue that if the jail were accredited by the ACA, it would at least appear to be a conflict of interest for me as executive director and an employee to be on any kind of review team, Gondels said. No ACA employee is going to be part of the team. That's what he himself said. So I think one thing he, Mr. Gondels himself, and the commissioner or the department ought to explain to us is, what's different now? Why was it an apparent conflict of interest then, and it's not a conflict of interest for Mr. Gondels to be here conducting this inspection? Again, if we were looking at an inspection and it had all that we would expect in an independent investigation, if Mr. Nelson, who of course has been unusually willing to be forthright despite the potential that that might have, has been willing to give public testimony, has been willing to speak publicly, if he came to you and said, well, actually, they came and inspected for 2 days. It was a surprise inspection. People were led into a room and they were given anonymous interviews. No management was present. They looked at documents. Then at least we would have to say, well, there's the appearance of a conflict of interest, as Mr. Gondels himself confirmed. But perhaps this time the ACA is truly conducting an independent investigation. But everything we see about these visits suggests that they are nothing but a sham. They are a rubber stamp for business as usual. The purpose of this investigation is to have an investigation. It is not to actually get to the bottom of what is actually going on. It goes to Mr. Finley's question, which is the department really responding? Here's what the department is not doing. The department is not setting up any mechanism whereby we can actually get to the bottom of what is really going on in these facilities, whereby we can figure out how out at West Tennessee, when we have internal memos showing that having 70 vacancies creates a completely untenable situation, why we should now assume that having 140 vacancies doesn't create an even worse situation. Nobody is saying, since we have all these obvious incident reports showing obvious assaults that are being reclassified as non-assaults, what we should do about that. What the department is not doing is actually conducting a real investigation so that they can tell the taxpayers who pay for their operations that they're actually doing their jobs and that they actually have a plan for correcting these problems. We shouldn't have to rely on employees anonymously sending information to one state representative's website to get to the bottom of a critical public policy issue. I'd like to put a human face on this too, because I think we're getting down here, we're talking about conflicts of interest and all these legal issues. I provided you, and you've received a lot of documents like this, and these are just representative. Just a couple more incident reports whereby activities that in any other context would be assaults are being reclassified as other than assaults. And the point is here not to further get into this point that over and over again the department is trying to portray an unsafe situation as safe by reclassification, but to just tell you what we're dealing with here, what these employees are dealing with on a day-to-day basis. You can look in here. These are employees that are having bodily fluids thrown in their eyes. You know, bodily fluids that could contain hepatitis, that could contain diseases. These employees are getting bodily fluids thrown in their eyes. They are getting punched. They are getting sexually assaulted. You can read these statements for themselves. This is the sort of activity that these folks are facing every single day in these prisons. We can assemble 30 of these documents for you. The point is, this is a serious, serious problem for our correctional officers, for our public, and it is time for the department to take this seriously and not spend time coming up with investigations that will give the impression of an investigation, but to actually figure out a way to conduct an independent investigation. I've suggested ways that could be done. There may be other ways. I would invite the department to come up with a protocol for actually getting to the bottom of these problems. One final point on that same issue. You know, we reported last week that a low-level, or I won't say low-level, but a rank-and-file employee was arrested at her home, apparently after a lengthy investigation designed to figure out how a news channel got a hold of a tape showing a prisoner casually beating an officer to the ground and beating him at length, knowing, obviously, that no one was present to intervene. What does that tell you about that institution? So what we know is we have a department that spent an extraordinary amount of time investigating how that videotape was provided to the public, a videotape that is a public document. Where's the result of the department's investigation of its own activities that should reveal to us how that was even possible, how that prisoner was put in a situation where he could beat an officer repeatedly, knowing that no one would come to the officer's aid? Where is the department's investigation of the severe beating, rather than the investigation of the correctional officer that is alleged to have brought that incredible incident to the public's attention? The department needs to stop spending its time covering itself and start spending its time correcting these activities. Thank you. With that, I'll answer any questions.
You're basically alleging the sin of Watergate, cover-up, and dangerous activities within the prison system. So, again, how does this office, the legislature, deal with it, stop it, fix it?
Well, unfortunately, as we know, the Republicans in the legislature eliminated the Correctional Oversight Committee, and so we don't have the formal committee we used to, which could hold hearings and investigate. Now, luckily, we've had committee chairs that have attempted to get to the bottom of this. What I plan to do is continue to obtain documents and bring the truth forward as much as possible. But I'm constrained significantly because while Mr. Nelson is bravely willing to come forward and tell you the truth, let's face it, I can't say that if I were a correctional officer and my children were relying on me to bring home a paycheck every week, that I would be willing to come forward and speak to you. Who knows? I think the climate we've seen should suggest that most correctional officers are not in a position where they can come forward, so they have to speak anonymously.
Raising the question, does he have a parachute? Not necessarily a golden parachute, but you have a way to...
Oh, yeah.
What other questions are there?
What's going to be done? I mean, what can you do next? It seems we've been to your office for several of these press conferences, and then you don't get much response from the governor's office. You don't get much response from the correctional department.
Here's the unfortunate next step. I tell you what's ultimately going to happen is we're going to have another lawsuit and we're going to be back under federal control. Remember, we used to have a Corrections Oversight Committee because the federal government had to take control of our prison system. And ultimately, thanks a lot to the leadership of Governor McWhorter, we were able to get out from under that federal control and get back on track. Ultimately, what will happen, I'll tell you what I plan to do is I will continue to raise this issue. I sent one FOIA request over today, and I will continue, if no further information is forthcoming, I will continue to make FOIA requests. I can enforce those in court, and I'm absolutely prepared to do so. But I think over time, as this issue, and thanks to your reporting, continues to be reported, what's going to happen is pressure will build, and ultimately we will have a lawsuit and we will be back under federal control. That is where we're headed right now, is back to the situation we were in the 80s, where we are declared to not be able to handle our own business in Tennessee, and where, because of these activities that are not being corrected because of the department's unwillingness to correct its own situation, we're going to have a federal lawsuit, and a federal judge will end up coming in and being tasked with correcting these problems. Because I can assure you, if people think that you're going to have a bunch of prisons, many of which are now overcrowded, being understaffed systematically over time, with correctional officers being routinely beaten by the inmates, at some point the courts are going to step in and prevent that. We are not going to be able, the Department of Correction is not going to be given the freedom to simply whitewash this indefinitely.
So have you spoken with Attorney General Rivera about this? And if this does go to federal court, there's bound to be a plaintiff beyond just the United States Attorney. If this is happening to guards, what's happening to prisoners?
It's a very good question. I have not spoken to the Attorney General because my view is I'm still hopeful that the administration will take charge of its own situation, and that ultimately we will have a systematic, honest, forthright public response involving confidential interviews with people in the prisons, real efforts to determine what is actually going on the ground, and an appropriate response that is public and forthright. I am still hoping that that is what the administration will do. I have seen no indication as yet that that is going to be forthcoming, but I want Tennessee to correct its own problem. No, I don't want to bring the federal government in, because I think in Tennessee we've shown for many years in many contexts we have an effective government and we can do a good job. This particular department needs to get its act together quickly, and this ACA so-called inspection suggests a department that is not ready to take the steps that need to be taken to forthrightly and honestly address the problems that have been raised.
Well, cruel and inhuman punishment is unconstitutional. Are you not predicting or just hoping that it doesn't go to federal court?
Here's what I think. I think in many cases the Tennessee state government has shown that it can operate very effectively. I think there's still time for the governor to take charge of this situation and to straighten out these problems. Apparently we need to hire more correctional officers. We need a top-to-bottom analysis of the management problems that have led to our current situation, and there's no reason we can't do that in-house with our own people. But we need, first of all, to address the problems in a forthright, independent way with a real investigation. And the ACA visit that we just had, 5 prisons in 3 days, couple hours of prison, no real honest, closed interviews, that is not an inspection.
Is this a good summary? Let's do it ourselves before Uncle Sam steps in.
I think that's right. Yes, that is a good summary. Any other questions? It's a complicated issue. Obviously, I'm available if you have other questions or questions about the document.